Good evening.
Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. Well, nice to see everyone. Looks like a few more people are coming in. Well, just so you folks online know, that's Wendy coming in. Wendy. Well, it feels like summer has come early. And quite magical. Did you ride your bike here, Holly?
Yes.
Well, you always ride your bike here, though, so that's a safe assumption.
No,
Oh, not always.
I usually drive.
Ah.
I'm a fair weather rider.
All right. Well, I thought we'd start off tonight's class. With reflections and questions about the Sila Teisho that people have been reading. So feel free to offer kind of a reflection, something that's really struck you. We'll probably have about 10 minutes to fill this space and share this time together. And then if you have any questions or clarifying questions, things that just totally didn't make sense, feel free to throw those my way and I'll field them as best I can. So yeah, sort of open the floor. And once again, people in the hall, when you ask a question, maybe wait a second and wait for Joichi to get the mic on you so people online can catch the entirety of your question.
I was rather distracted this last week, so I didn't reread it, so it's not very fresh.
Sure. You're probably not alone. Anyone? There's nothing rattling around? Just going shy. Rose?
Right, Genjo. Yeah. I wrote some of this down before I came, but I forgot to bring that paper, but there's bits in here that I'm chewing on that deals with the interplay of illuminating delusion in this talk. And it would be better if I could pull the lines, which I wrote, but if there's something that you could speak to, because it's throughout here, and if I look back, I can find the sections that I'm wondering about. But if you know what I'm talking about, how much it is interspersed in here.
Yeah, so the words you were using there were illuminating,
delusion, the delusory mind.
Yeah.
Even in the last paragraph, he's saying it's about the way in which the Buddha's illumination and sentient beings' delusion are essentially not two.
Yeah.
Like, there's that. How is that? How is illumination and delusion not two?
Yeah.
So, there's that piece, but then it comes in and out other places too.
Yeah, so if I'm hearing correctly, the kind of interplay between how we'll often hear about Buddhist practice where it's like, there is an A and there's a B. there's a starting point of delusion and there's an end point of awakening. And then within that very kind of teaching that I think, kind of we all get and maybe feel on a regular basis, there's also that statement, which is, where was it?
Well, what I've read was in that last paragraph, almost the last line.
Yeah, it's about waking up with all beings. It's about the way in which the Buddha's illumination and sentient beings' delusion are essentially not two. Yeah. I know, right? For me, where that strikes, the word terrain comes up. That I think of human life as being a particular multifaceted terrain. And when certain energies are active in my heart, being, mind, I'm doing a lot of work to try and control that terrain. I'm labeling, I don't want to go here, I want to go here. And implying utilizing all of these odd manipulations, levers, buttons, everything I can find to alter my experience so I have a certain relationship with the things in my world, right? That's the camp we usually call delusion. And then, there's a beautiful quote that we enjoy that you oftentimes chant here in the mornings, that the mother of wisdom is a perfect flow of, she's an illuminating fountain of light. Her body is like a fountain of light, in which in one sense, right, we can feel colors and we can see there's a kind of texture to that light, but in one sense in human experience, there's a sameness to it. There's an equality between different colors of light. And so I think of that much more as the terrain of awakening, that moving through the day, there's all sorts of sensations, many of which are pleasant and unpleasant, but that the essential human heart might not be fighting so hard against them, that there's an equality amongst that hardness, that softness, that squishiness, that tightness, that looseness, that's the flow of light. And within this other frame of mind, we are doing the very best we can to battle with that and manipulate it and cut off certain bits and make other bits more important. And so within there, the last bit that's saying the Buddha's awakening and our delusion are not different. That's saying that we are actually endowed with that fountain of light, and we really spend so much time just trying to fight or fighting that terrain, which is actually the terrain of awakening, that we won't go anywhere essentially different. Yeah. Does that pick up on that? Does that feel like it landed for you? Yeah. And yet within that, like we can't just jump to that experience really. There are some schools of Buddhism which really do sort of hammer on that really strongly. That's saying you must see through it directly, right now, rah, wake up. It tends to have a very masculine edge to it. And that practice really has quite a bit of power. And also, and I think in my teacher's view and some things I've seen, things can get really weird. Things can go off rail really quickly when you're channeling that kind of energy to totally see through that there can be really places of blindness that you keep tight, or you don't allow a kind of softness for something to unfold in a certain amount of time. And compassion can be left off pretty quickly. So, those are both sides of teaching, something that's more gradual and slow and coming into it, which I think our Soto Zen in general tends to lean towards, and Rinzai tends to lean a little more towards, you gotta cut through delusion, you must experience Satori, you must experience this light. That's really the goal. All flavors, both flavors are there in Buddhist teaching, I think, all the time. Sarah?
So there's a line on, I think, the second page here. So, for example, although something good is not always good, we hold stubbornly to what we think is good. Something evil is not always evil, yet we become attached to our own judgment and make it a preconception. So what I was thinking about with that is, so why are there definitive precepts then? Because it seems like if you're talking about morality being relative to the nuances of a situation and not fixed, why are the precepts set in a fixed manner or stated in a fixed manner?
Mm-hmm.
And why do they sound absolute if they aren't?
Yeah, great question, Sarah. That's exactly what I'm going to be talking about later tonight. So maybe we'll pause that. Yeah, totally. How can you say anything about it at all? And in one sense, compared to the rest of the Buddhist world, our precepts looked very much defanged. They look very much like what did Ejo say when we were prepping for this class? It's like you've joined the team that didn't want to try very hard. So yeah, we'll unpack that. How about tonight? And if I don't really scratch that itch for you, what? Say that again.
It still seems like the team's trying too hard.
Yeah, definitely. I feel that way too. But you got to admit they're also quite vague. There's not do not kill. It doesn't tell you what's alive and what's not. Right? I don't know. Ejo in one of his talks he was talking about. He says I don't know, smushing a plankton or something and cutting down an oak tree. Like sometimes you think, oh, well, the thing that moves, obviously that's the more alive thing for many people, and the tree might not seem alive to many people, or even like a shrimp, he said, maybe.
Well, that's the other thing about the precepts is that you inherently can't do them because everything is alive, for instance, all the plants that you eat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So
yeah, definitely, there's a bind in there.
So why are they so pointed if you can't even do them and they don't apply to all situations, but they sound like they do?
So I would say there's a bind on one particular way of viewing the world, and that posit that there are other ways of viewing the world, that they can be kept completely. Posit that for now. Aaron?
If I'm remembering, there was maybe an anecdote towards the end about cause and effect. And I think I found myself reading it a few times and then just moving on. And so do you mind taking a minute to just expand on
Pai Chang and his fox.
that?
Yeah, this one, I wouldn't have much to say about that, but we spent a whole, maybe 3 or 4 months on it at some point.
Okay.
In one sense, I think if I can put it in my own terms and how I understand it, the essential line is, does an awakened person fall into cause and effect or not? And in one sense, if we say, okay, you're a Buddha, you're completely awakened, right? You would say that they do not fall into cause and effect. Living beings are kind of trapped and confused by cause and effect, let's say. That my action sort of leads to this, and then it has a repercussion, and then I sort of sense and feel out what that was, and then I go again. That's kind of, maybe we could say, the clunky model for being a deluded being is. You don't have full understanding of that. And we could say, a clunky understanding of what a Buddha is that they've penetrated that so completely that they no longer view it as cause and effect, maybe. There's just there's often these epithets of the Buddha as all-knowing one, that they're omniscient. And I used to read that for years and just be like, oh, whatever, they're just embellishing that. But I think it's omniscient on a level of being that we can't fully understand, that we're always kind of experiencing laid out in time through cause and effect, where a Buddha has become so intimate with cause and effects that eventually it just merges with a kind of knowing and completeness of being. Right? That sounds pretty good. So, does a Buddha fall into cause and effect or not? And the guy gets basically trapped, or he makes a mistake that throws him into the purgatories of cause and effect. So he becomes a wily fox. And that imagery is a little bit of a trickster, and it's slightly like a little bit of a curse. He made a wrong move and kind of got punished for it. And because he said no, that a Buddha doesn't fall into cause and effect. But I think rather, I just imagine my teacher over me with a stick if I make a wrong word about this, but that the Buddha or an awakened being, it's sort of neither. They neither fall into cause and effect, nor they do not fall into cause and effect. They live completely aligned with something that allows them to penetrate it in a totally full way that's hard to fathom. It's not like they've just lifted off karma and cause and effect, but they're so in tune with it that it is just not the same flowing that we experience as living beings. So there is a kind of transcendence there, but it's not like it's separated. It's a transcendent through and within and as. Does that make any sense? Yeah, and probably if it doesn't, that means I probably did a better job of explaining it. So, Well, maybe we'll leave it at that for that
Yeah,
one.
no, I think that's,
And those kinds of teaching stories are really fun because they're fairly impenetrable. And that's almost a good sign of you're probably learning something as you're attending to it, rather than the easy one-liners that like, yeah, got it, but the thing that stretches you to imagine what it's going for. So. How about, can we draw anyone out online? And Jacob?
I think he's still connecting.
Jacob, I don't know if you're speaking, but we can't hear you yet.
Okay, sorry.
There you
I have this set up both on my computer so I can see better, and then on my phone, so it's just a little
gotcha.
back and forth. Sorry. The piece that caught me throughout reading Teisho is kind of, and the story involving the fox and that transformation. It didn't really settle with me in any way until kind of sitting down, kind of just now to begin this discussion, as it kind of something clicked a little bit, and I think it's the current of like internal versus external, and the ways in which they are same, because the gentleman that is turned into the fox by misunderstanding what awakening is reminds me of the monk, never disrespectful. The two of them seem like similar. The difference is, I think never disrespectful is very external in the understanding, whereas I feel like the monk who becomes the fox and then is eventually liberated is very internal, because they're both hinting at the same piece, which is that part of seeing and kind of correct. I feel like it's sort of right view, right seeing, because the ultimate conclusion, it comes down to be that the like a Buddha or an awakened one is not blind to the cause and effect. It's not that they don't live in cause and effect. It's not that they are not surrounded by it. It's not that they're not influenced by it, but it's that they see it and they see where it comes up. And I feel like in that regard, that is also that point is also really driven forward in the story of Never Disrespectful, because his whole experience is about being as verbally and earnestly respectful to all beings that he encounters, whether they bow to him or cast sticks upon him. Regardless of who he encounters, he meets them all gently and with kind of a sense of like to put it one way, right cause. And that leads him to sort of right effect.
Yeah, I really like that. I feel very astute. I had never imagined that before, that internal and external weighing of those, and that there's a trust in a kind of cause and effect right there, that he knows that if he meets beings with, I don't know, I would use the words like kind of unconditional positive regard, even if someone's making a huge mistake, doing awful things to him, he says, I know you're on the same wheel of suffering, and the only way to relieve that is Buddhahood. And you may have made a mistake now, but that's fine. You are on this train too. And in Pai Cheng's fox story, the being blind to cause and effect was a misstep in that cause and effect that he had to clarify for a kind of release. So both yeah, that both that internal and external levels of that seem to be really present. Yeah, thanks for sharing. Maybe time for one more? Is it really 7:45? Wow.
I would say something if there's a few more minutes.
Yeah, Tammy, go for it.
I just think the writing is so beautiful in this, and there are many things that really speak to me, but especially I wrestle, or it resonates with me, the parts where Genjo talks about like our attempts to push and pull, and that awakening doesn't lie in those attempts at pushing and pulling, and also the paragraph where he talks about our yearning for right and wrong to be clear, and and he asks, can you see your complete inability to judge anything? This that a standard is always in the realm of fundamental delusion. Insisting to know what is right and wrong before acting is moral cowardice. Insisting to know this is not what ethics is asking us to do.
It's a really sharp sword he's wielding there.
I think I like the sharp sword, sharp swords myself.
Yeah. I think something really interesting with that dynamic, the clarity that's required in there, something I really appreciate about talks in, say, more of the Theravadan school and teachings, and it seems like in the Buddha's time, there was very little. It was actually very common for people to talk about their attainments and their understanding of things. Like to be very clear about where they are. Like there are these 4 levels of kind of awakening: a stream enterer, a stream soaker, I forget the terms, you're like fully in the stream, and other kind of terms. And so I think a challenge there is, how do you discern on one level that there's an ethically right and wrong thing to do? And so for us, like, how do you judge someone's trustworthiness and your own heart's relationship with that, without it also being some like essential, you're not able to know them at the same time. So there's a practical working with people and meeting people and judging and feeling capacities, but at the same time, how do you let that unconditional positive regard for someone, that deep belief that everyone's on the path and will become Buddha, how do you let that be present at the exact same time? That for me is a question that comes out, or a place of pointing within those kinds of questions, or those kinds of points Genjo's making in here. Yeah. But that yearning for clarity is moral cowardice. Ooh. Yeah. Which in a sense, like, I think you can all feel the place where that can get too tight, and I think lose some sense that we should be yearning for some sort of clarity in our ethical life. But we can get bound on just wanting to be right. We can get bound on just wanting to avoid any bumps or scrapes and become sort of paralyzed out of that wish for correctness, that wish for kind of purity, or thinking that such a place exists, without the bumps and bruises. All right, well, I think I'd like to switch gears into some talking I'm going to do at you all tonight. We'll start off with a quick review of just that lightning fast review of Buddhism that I offered last class, and I'll do sort of like an even faster roundup of all the principles. But I think I know many of us are new to Buddhism, so I think it's good to settle in a kind of a shared framework. And so the very first posit that all things internal and external are present, touching, and immanent, and at the same time simultaneously ungraspable and beyond my ability to know objectively. That things are shockingly ephemeral and intimate. at the same time. And just a quick note, you'll see like it's very interesting as we're switching right there into kind of like that's a metaphysical like statement of Buddhism. How much does that just align with our discussion of ethics right there?
Mm-hmm.
That that side of unknowable while also totally present, and that both have to be alive. So as I'm going through this, you can be sort of picking up those things and letting them draw out a tune for you. All right, all things shockingly ephemeral and totally intimate at the same time. We can't see the backside of everything or anything, including our own selves. And so Buddhism states that this isn't actually a problem, but rather anxiety and suffering and dissatisfaction in our lives results when we attempt to concretize the world, when we want to know an objective sense of things beyond relationship, to see things beyond the eyes with which I see them, to control without responding to an alive and unchanging world. That these are the roots, and these, classically greed, hate, and then ignorance. And one framing of that is both greed and hate are arising from ignorance. That this is the root of suffering in a Buddhist sense. And this forms a misguided running from a mystery which is at the heart of life. So in one sense, that seems like we can kind of whitewash the deep suffering that's present in human life. That war and violence and abuse and addictions, right? Just, you might be able to hear that. It's like, oh, it's very neat and clean. Just surrender, meditate more. Get over your hang-ups and let it go, and then life will be better. You'll be at ease. I think we all know it's not that simplistic, even though many of the teachings can sound like that. But rather that the teachings are offering us a perspective that when I enact my fixed views on the world and myself, we can rather turn to a way where we let interrelationship be the source of my certainty and my power. So kind of inverting our usual sense of wanting to get that clear picture, right? Rather letting murkiness be a place of my decision making. See, there's a difference there. We have to feel into something in a different way. We have to allow our one-sided perspective to be present. And from there we can draw a kind of power. From our interrelationship, we can draw our power and our strength. And letting the mystery of an alive world direct how I see, move, and take care of life. Right? Not that I need to know the meaning, that I can know the purpose, but that acknowledging the mystery, the ungraspability, can be a source and the guiding light for how I meet and interact with the world. I think that's another poetic way of turning these Buddhist teachings on their head, that it's not just a ladder to awakening, but we begin to rely on these things that inform us of different ways of living. And so from this kind of very nutshell of Buddhism, there were a few arenas which the Buddha pointed to, which said, if you want to live like this, here are a few places you need to pay attention, or places that you can train and look at and we can talk about that can help you live from this place of vitality. And those places were wisdom, concentration, and ethics. Those were the places. And in one sense, I think this is really beautiful. You could think of each one of them as being perfectly composed of the other two. So wisdom, if the front face of that, and wisdom kind of being the perfect perception of the exactly that, the ungraspability of things. The backside of that is composed of concentration, settledness might be another word there. Samadhi is the Sanskrit term, that that collectedness, and ethical living or ethical relationship with beings, sila. And for ethics, what we're studying now, wisdom and concentration are the supports of that. Yeah. Broadly, any alarm bells for anyone? Probably not. And so in our first class, sort of broadly speaking, I was talking about various things to help kind of energize our ethical, moral imaginations, and talking about our individual ethical notions and frameworks that have come to us through many, many streams, just kind of placing ourselves in context through family, religious traditions, culture, countercultures, all the different flows we can point to that flow through us, give us our sort of de facto ethical lenses. And as none of these things are fixed and always in flow, the same is true for Buddhist ethics and how they've been lived in the world. So I want to point a little bit, I want to draw sort of a historical narrative tonight about how this particular, many of you in here have the 16 Bodhisattva precepts in front of you. Did you get that, Matthew? Oh, okay, good. And folks online, just like 3 minutes before class, I emailed something to you, which you don't have to look at right now. We'll need it more towards the end of class. But that's the formulation of the Bodhisattva precepts. So when we've used this word jukai, people receive jukai from Ejo here, for example, and have a raksu, that's a symbol, and a symbol, I don't like the word symbol, the actuality of receiving the precepts worn as a robe. That's the ethical code that's taken on, those 16 Bodhisattva precepts, which has happened to have changed over a lot from the original ethical code that was primarily in use 2,500 years ago in India. So that was called the Vinaya. And this word Vinaya is Sanskrit, and it means to lead away from. And presumably they're the greed, hate, and delusion, the three poisons that cause suffering. And this is really the concrete monastic code that monks and nuns, or bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, lived by. It was the sort of the blood of religious life, basically, to be in the order. And so for a fully ordained bhikkhu, there were 227 rules that were followed, 227. And for bhikkhunis, there were 311. And so note there that there's a little bit of a disparity, 96 more, something like that. I'm not so great at math. 94 more? Yeah. There's more for bhikkhunis. And some of those are pretty straight up misogynist and shitty, I think. So, for example, one of the conditions for the bhikkhuni order to be created was that when that request was made and finally granted through the help of Ananda, who he sort of came to the aid of the women who wanted to enter the order and said, "You said anyone can achieve liberation. Hey, I'm here. I want to do it this way." Where was I going with that? The sort of misogynist, shitty precepts that they received, or injunctions. And one was that they, no matter how long they had been a bhikkhuni for, they still had to bow down and basically treat as senior any monk, any man who had been ordained, even if it was moments ago. So I think that's utterly ridiculous. But I guess there's sides of that. I haven't read more nuanced discourse around that, so put a caveat around that. But also, all of these rules, there's a sutra where a monk who was foremost in virtue asked the Buddha to please lay out the full moral code. And the Buddha said, "I won't do that because," I forget if this was a commentary where it was said, but because how he did do it was that in response to situations, a new rule was made each time. So a number of these 311 for bhikkhunis happened because women were in a different social situation than men at that time. So for instance, if you were a woman walking alone at night, you were more likely to get attacked. And in order to, so I think that happened. And so there was a rule made that a bhikkhuni couldn't leave the monastery or walk without friends in the evening or something like that. So that's how the code was made. And so every little bit, and I haven't checked this in a long time, but someone told me that there's a rule against tickling other monks, because apparently these monks were bathing in the river, and a monk drowned from tickling. Someone was tickling him and something happened. I don't know, he got elbowed in the head, and so anywho, there's quite some random stuff, and many of the things in there are actually I think at least about 100 of them are strictly about deportment, like really how you carried yourself in the world. And there was basically like, yeah, we do that because that's the heart and energy we want to live by. And also very practical things, like you don't ask for a new alms bowl unless you have 5 chips in it. You need to have 5, and then you can ask for a new one. So there's some things in there that were just for regulating the harmony of the Sangha. So just kind of like, this is how we do it, just follow this rule, don't complain if it's not like that. So I think that's interesting. And there were 4 rules that got you kicked out. They called them the defeats. Can we guess what they are?
Murder of a human being.
Correct. Or arranging, you can't arrange an assassin. It also says that very clearly, so I hope that wasn't a situation. So that's one.
About spiritual attainment.
Oh, Joichi, you gave away the fun one. So it's really
The one that I remember.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. Lying about your spiritual attainment. So I think it was very common to say what you knew and what you saw and what you perceived. And if you knowingly, to gain benefit, said that you had achieved this state and you didn't, that's a big no-no. That like basically would like devalue the whole entire order. It would be really problematic. And so that was one of the rules. But if you made a mistake out of ignorance, it was like a lesser thing. So if you're like, sorry, I just didn't get it, then it was a lesser punishment.
How would that be validated?
Yeah, I know. I bet it was never enacted that someone was like, I just kidding. Yeah. So let's do lying about spiritual attainment, killing another human being.
Probably sexuality.
Yep. And it's sexual intercourse. They're very clear about it. Actually, there's 13 rules that were kind of like big infractions, but they didn't get you kicked out. You had a disciplinary period, and you might have be disrobed or like expelled from the order. You could come back, but there had to be a large gathering of monks there to help you back in. And all of those were like not sexual intercourse, but sexual acts, basically. Those were big infractions, but wouldn't get you kicked out. Last one. Stealing. So if you stole anything, and they're very specific about it, something of value at or more than 1/24 an ounce of gold per standard valuation of that at the time in the precinct that it was done in. Very specific. So stealing anything at that amount could get you kicked out. Kind of run in there. So then further, there's like very elaborate systems for maintaining this and procedures for how to do that. So twice a month there were Atonement Gatherings, which were quite full affairs. It sounds like you had to get together with your Sangha, and I think they might have done it in small groups, and there had to be a certain number of highly or like kind of more senior bhikkhus there or bhikkhunis there to make it valid. And you'd read the entire list, basically, or however many they had at the time. And at the time, after it was read, it would say, is everyone here clean of that sin, basically? And you might stand up and say, no, I am not. And then there would be like a certain procedure for how intense of a violation it was. And further, you could call someone out or be called out, which I think would be really intense and powerful and profound in all these levels. Something that happens here at Buddha Eye when we do this ceremony, which is called Fusatsu. You'll see that on our schedule regularly. We'll make announcements of it. In non-COVID times, when we're all in the same place and don't have people online, we have a part of our particular atonement ceremony where you're welcome to state something out loud that you would like to atone for. And I think it's one of the most regular, powerful things I experience is other adults facing up to things they feel ashamed of and want to make atonements for, and fully own in a certain way that's not just secret and huddled, but to trust Sangha and meet that together. So I encourage you to come to that. We'll have more teaching about that later in this class series about that particular practice we have here. Where am I going with this? So really, this was a huge aspect of your life as a renunciate in the Buddha's time. And I want to read you a little quote that really points out how important this Vinaya was and how important ethical conduct was. So this is from the Vinaya, a statement in there, that though the Buddha's discourses and advanced doctrines may be forgotten, so long as the Vinaya still exists, the Buddha's teachings yet endure. Right? So as long as there's this enactment of ethical living, the Buddha's teachings are like alive and well, even if all of the teachings about wisdom and concentration, that's actually the Abhidharma, that's what those other two things are pointing out, the advanced discourses and the sutras about wisdom. If those disappear, as long as the ethical living is still there, then the Buddha's order is still there. So this is what it meant to be a monk, is not to be wise or to look a certain way, though those, looking a certain way was a part of that, but to take on communal care of personal conduct. I really like that as I wrote it. Communal care of personal conduct. You're entrusting, right? Someone can call you out in your group. You're choosing to take group responsibility for yourself and also for others, for how you live and move in the world. And you could say that this must have been just a huge part of life then. And so much of it, that feels so, it feels pretty foreign to me to think about that level of care for how you act. And actually maybe having some experience in monasteries in Japan, I have an inkling of that. You could get called out for things. And usually it was like, you did this wrong or you did this wrong. But that intense preciousness of taking care of each other's actions and allowing, some comment on other people's lives and their comment on your life. I don't know, I think that's just quite a foreign thing in maybe American society, but you can see how it's highlighted here as a real value. So this ethical code, backbone of the Buddha's order, it had some bumps for its longevity. And after the Buddha's death, there were a couple of councils. One was, I think, just a number of months after the Buddha had died. They gathered together and said, like, whoa, the Buddha has passed into parinirvana. How are we going to continue? What does this mean for us? How are we going to go forward? And then one was, I think, quite some number of years later, maybe 40 years later. But these councils eventually led to a split in the Sangha. The northern sect that emerged is the Mahayana, which translates to the Great Vehicle, which is the school that we're a part of. And the South School became what we now call the Theravada. So they still wear saffron robes, and you could say they are the conservatist? What's the word I'm looking for? Conservative. There we go. Orthodox. Totally. Orthodox, conservative sect of Buddhism. And really what the split was about, kind of this hilarious story where apparently before the Buddha's death, he had told his attendant Ananda, he said, Ananda, we can get rid of the 10 petty precepts. It's okay, we can expunge those from the Patimoksha, the collection of rules. And Ananda told this to the group of all the elders, and they said, wow, that's amazing. So which ones are the 10 petty ones? And he said, guys, I totally forgot to ask him. He said he was so shocked that you could remove any of them because they were so important that he totally forgot to ask. And so these kind of these disagreements, these debates were like, whoa, which one were the 10? Surely it was these ones. And then people were like, no, we need those ones. And so there was a group that said, no, we can't take any out, and a group that said, yes, we can take some out, which actually really points well to being why we have the kind of ancestral lineage we have, because the Mahayana was the one that said we can remove some. So it said we can change and move, whereas the Orthodox school said, no, we need to keep them just as they are and continue this wheel as it is. So that Mahayana school, you start to see there's some wiggle room. And so this is the school that goes up into China and Tibet and lands there. Right? And interesting, the Mahayana means a great vehicle. And so I think a kind of question in there is like, well, how do we keep everyone on board? This is really the great vehicle. Can this religion, can this way move to a completely different culture if it stays so static and locked into particular historical and exact circumstances of one culture? And so I don't have so much research here, and I haven't done so much reading, but in the hundreds of years after that, obviously a different culture around Buddhism in China began to take root. In particular, an important sutra became kind of front and center. It's called the Brahmanet Sutra. Many people have heard this teaching about Indra's net. People heard this? That Indra is a particular god, a very important god in the Buddhist pantheon. And the idea is he has this net where one jewel has innumerable facets that reflect every other jewel in it. It's kind of like a big, tent in one sense is what the image that comes to me. So if you look at one part of it, it reflects every other jewel in there. Or I think if you pull on one tab of it, it pulls on all the rest of them. So it's a teaching about emptiness, fullness in that way. So that's where that image comes off. That's a little side note. But it also lays out basically exposition of what's very close to what we have as the Bodhisattva precepts. So that begins to gain in prominence. But also, almost all monasteries are following pretty much a modified version of the Vinaya. So having a very strict code is quite central to how monasteries are working and developing. And there's a well-developed monastic class within there. So it's important in our narrative. In the 800s in Japan, a particular monk, the founder of the Tendai sect of Buddhism, which is a living group of sect of Buddhism in Japan today, he advocated strongly for the use of only the Bodhisattva precepts and not having the Vinaya included. And he had all sorts of spiritual reasons for that, but also at the time, the way, I just can't fathom this, being an American in particular, the monastic institutions, the religious schools were so entwined with the government that basically the rules of what it meant to be a monk were also laws. And so for example, just about 200 years ago, the law was lifted for monks to be eating meat and marrying. Actual laws that were encoded in the government. Apparently, those things were likely happening lots before that, but there was a law, right? The important part. And so the government at that time controlled the ordination platforms. There were these certain, I have no image of what they looked like, but there was a platform and that's where it happened. And they said, this is how you do it. And then they were put in a registry, right? And the government had a view, had a perception and a list of everyone who had been ordained if it was in the right way. So they're really intertwined here. And so there were also political reasons for Saicho was his name, wanting to make a disconnect from that. And so, just I think a number of years after his death, his wish was granted, and that became more and more the way. And I think it might have just also been quite a bit easier if you could go outside of the particular sort of rules and circumstances that the government imposed upon you. So this was a really big shift in how what it meant to be a monk, basically, is that you didn't have all these very strict behavior injunctions that you were signing up for. And one way we can understand what happened there, this difference between the Bodhisattva precepts and something more like the Vinaya, is that this is the word, the full word that is often used to describe the Vinaya. I think it might be the exact translation of Vinaya, actually, through Japanese. And this word here is kai, this character is kai, and this one is ritsu. And kai points to the spirit, meaning, and the essence and source of ethical life. Sila. I think this character alone more pertains to sila. Ritsu, kai ritsu, points to the rule, behavioral injunction, code, form, and shape. And you can see how it's really practical if you're trying to maintain an order and have, say, like, we're in this together, right? Like, we can see each other. we know how we function. We have something that we can rub together against each other and have a common understanding about. It's the injunctions. Here's what we don't do. We can have an understanding that you don't kill, but I can't really see if you are wishing well-being for all living beings. I mean, you kind of can, right? But it's much more slippery, you can't really see it. Versus the Ritsu, that's what was emphasized over time to keep the order together. Right. So we can think of what happened there in that evolution after the 800s in Japan, that really just the kai was preserved and the Ritsu was discarded with. And apparently in Japan now, there's only one school of Buddhism left that keeps the Ritsu, or something like the Vinaya, and they're really just called the Precepts school. That's their umph, and it's very, I think Edo said there's just like one temple left or something like that. So really, I mean, vastly, this sort of wave overtook how Buddhism flowed through Japan, that this became the prominent way. So even today, now within our particular school, the founder of Sodo Zen, Dogen Zenji, in his writings about precepts, they're called Bosatsu Kai. Bosatsu, Bodhisattva, that's what that word there is, Bosatsu Kai. So they are the spirit and meaning of the Bodhisattva, and in terms of ethical living. Right, do people feel, does that arc roughly make sense? I mean, there's some pretty big gaps in there. Yeah, Rose.
I have a question about the lay folks. So, well, it's two questions, but more on contemporary, because in the West, people in the Sangha, in the lay community, asked to receive precepts, but in all this history, it's the monastics. Mm-hmm. And so was this a divergence because of Western appropriation, so to speak? I just don't know what's happening in Japan. I'm thinking about when I was living in Hawaii, really none of the Sangha members, it wasn't a thing where people were wearing rakusu or... Yeah.
So it's not a historical deviation that actually, I'm pretty sure this is a true statement, that you could take the 10 precepts, or the 5, the 8, or the 10 that have been the numbers of precepts that have been used over time, and that non-monastic people could take those, non-bhikkhu. And further, if you became a, like what we kind of might here call a postulant at Buddha Eye Temple, like you want to be a monk, they had sort of novice monks in the Buddha's time that would take just the 10 precepts, and that actually ordination was synonymous with taking on the full pratimoksha. So not a deviation. I'm not sure how common it was. However, my feeling was that, at least in modern Japan, this has been a powerful way to spread the Dharma, that actually people are taking the precepts in Japan. My dear friend, she's an 84-year-old flower teacher in Japan. 87, now like 88 or 89. She's still kicking. She took the precepts last year, so it's still happening. And then something, just an aside for those of you who might think this is fun or interesting, that word tantra, tantric. So I think one shift we might be able to see here is that if you think of that vast list of rules and codes, it feels kind of clunky and a little bit like external in a sense, versus you sort of, once you take the spirit of these, you're kind of pressed right up against the awakening mind, is a way that it started to be talked about, that beyond all the rules, the way was transmitted teacher to teacher, mind to mind. It seems like that once this transition was happening, that narrative began to grow. And so the idea being, I mean, really beautifully, say when you take the precepts, you're acknowledging, you're pressing together with the perfect mind of Buddha, and that your relationship with that perfect ethical heart is what is the source of your transformation. That there's this intimate meeting, this kind of secret thing that you can't fully see and understand, but you're laying on the heart of Buddha, and it's causing all this transformation in you. It's just a little aside there, but I think it's a really beautiful image that I like. Further, I got to do a very full precept ceremony in Japan once. It's a really elaborate ritual, and when you take the precepts, you get put on a high seat, which was quite high, and the teachers of the temple, they walked around with their staves and their full, nicest gear, and they said, I forget the exact translation, but something like, here is a child of the Buddha, they are sure to attain awakening. And you're honored as being having ascended the throne of awakening, and are treated in those moments like a perfect awakened being. And they go around 3 times. Just total wild faith in you to be a Buddha, that Bodhisattva never disrespecting. In a similar sense, if you've seen a Jukai, here the style that we do here, there's a lot of language that's similar to that lifting up. Maybe I want to put something in your head before we go tonight, and it'll require the sheet that I handed everyone, the 16 Bodhisattva precepts. And I just want to offer a quick entry point and sort of a real vital juice here that I want to point out. So the formulation, 16 Bodhisattva precepts. The first are the refuges. Also the same thing that we chant in Pali at the end of every class. That word saranam is that word refuge. Saranam, gacchami. So there's those guys. And that's really seen as you have to enter sort of taking on the faith or the belief and trust in something outside of your own immediate vision. So for me, this is kind of, I enter the realm of training. It's kind of taking refuge and taking this as my place of development, these beings, the Sangha. And then the 3 pure precepts where I want to spend some time with, just 5 minutes or so now. This is a place where I think there's a lot of the juice of what this particular code can do for us here. So we see that the 10 grave precepts following that, they're the injunctions of sort of don't do this. And many versions also have the positive version in there too. However, these 3 pure precepts, they act as kind of modifiers that really enrichen, I think, these 10 grave precepts. So this embracing codes and forms, often it's translated as refraining from evil. But actually, this is the literal translation of it. And the codes and forms, if you embrace them, you will not do any evil. That's their exact, that's the reason for their being there. And so you could think of these as kind of levels of depth of the precepts. So this first one, the word just comes to mind, it's just stop. You just gotta stop. If you're doing it in your actions, this is the place, the threshold where you just pull back. You gotta resist somewhere. The second one, this embracing good dharmas. What I wrote here is here is where you're invited to pour into goodness, to lean into the positive aspects of the precepts. So if it says not killing, and this is deeply cherishing and respecting all life. So you don't stop at just the sea of not killing. I didn't step on a bug today. But how do you have a view of life which is nourishing and respectful and appreciative? The third one, embracing living beings. And this is the real wild card. I think something it's just so beautiful and will keep you coming back to these on deeper and deeper levels I have a few points about it. And so one here is to grow that unconditional positive regard that we've been sort of mentioning tonight never disrespectful bodhisattva. That just sort of outside of all valuation of things, unconditional positive regard of beings. The second one, I think in this embracing living beings, the first two sound kind of manageable. And then when it says embrace living beings, to not fear the messiness of living. To not fear the fact that very few things will be totally clean cut. And that the task is here to stay with beings. Stay with them, not just cut off. And that doesn't mean that at times we need to draw boundaries. Super important. But there's a difference between cutting a boundary and just trying to push away and forget versus drawing a boundary and keeping a connection with what that boundary means, what it means for you, your feelings around that, the whole rich liveliness that's there and present. So I think that's pointing to that kind of a boundary and what it means to stay with beings. And the last one, the always fun and important aspect of beings, that there's the internal and the external aspect of this. So for those who were in the last class, I wrote here the living beings of selves and others. So this, I think, is a place that feels really rich for my own life, that I can think of my non-self as actually a vast flowing collection and commune of many selves that are appearing and disappearing all the time. That's what I could call myself if I could call it anything. And so we have, what does it mean to embrace those living beings, this living being? So it really struck me the other night. I was going to bed and I sort of sensed I was cold in one area of my body and needed another blanket, and I sort of gruffly, in an odd position, grabbed the blanket, pulled it over myself. And it felt all kind of violent. It was really odd just being ugh, that didn't feel so good. You kind of accomplished what you wanted. But I realized that I had attended to something I needed as a being, but also at the very same time, a part of me wishes for gentleness and attentiveness and wants that for myself. And I realized within that very moment, I had kept attending to this one being and broken it for this other being. Whereas now, imagine that being oh, I see you're a little bit cold. Okay, let's move slowly and attentively and take care of the wholeness of this being here, right? So I think that's a place where it really is a deep dive in how we sharpen our ethical sensitivity, which is a term I'm really excited to be talking more about. I think it's very easy to get hung up in questions of this in the external sense, but and those are really important to dive into all the, Sarah, you were talking about certain levels, how can I live without killing anything? That's one level of it, but also within this self, how many of these dynamics are moving and flowing within layers of my being all the time. How can we have that as a place of sharpening and growing? So I want to offer some quick homework that I'm encouraging everyone to find an ethical hook in your belly. And that's how that's an image that appears for me, that when I just slightly cut something off or haven't been true to something, whether in myself or in others, take a moment, one day or one moment, one afternoon when you have some time, and just feel around a bit. And I would encourage you not to think, not just try and find the story that's coming, really feel into your belly is the image I get of where you can find really rich stuff, meaning what's dragging behind me in a certain sense, and I'm not free of it. And how did that have to do with my intention and my action and my perception of that situation? Where's the lines that you tripped? And which ones are here? And so I'd like people, if you're so willing, to write a few sentences about that. We did this last class, is where people had something to share, and then and then people will send those in to me. So just email me at the office is fine, the office email, and then I'll put those in a compendium and I'll send that to everyone. So it can be a way, I found the last one so rich where people shared their, what was alive for them in the class, and this will be what's a little ethical kernel that you're feeling into and learning about and offering kind of your perspective on. So quick tip with that, don't overshare. So be sort of mindful of that. The purpose of this is not to virtue signal, I like that word, not to show just, how sensitive you are or something like that, or practicing vulnerability. So be a little mindful of that and how what you share might relate with other people. But really it's about feeling into this framework, I would say, in particular, and kind of what levels of that feel alive in a way that feels interesting or extending for your usual way of understanding. And I think that'll just be incredibly fun to read. I'm really excited for that. And I think I just thought I'd share this, that as I've been feeling into this more, I'm realizing that most of my own brutality, unkindness, like a lack of sincere caring, it's mostly for these selves. It's mostly in my own heart, inflicted on my own ideas of myself. And, and further kind of just sharing here, I wonder how much that's related to my deep wish to be kind to people. I have that very forefront in my mind all the time. And I think there's an odd kind of balancing in my being I'm doing there. So there's all sorts of kinds of ways. I just offer that as a place. I think I'm not alone in that, maybe in that kind of leaning. I think it can be very common. So I guess, there's just, I think if you apply these kinds of lenses to your own heart in places that you feel stuck or feel alive in relationships, we can tease out a lot about balance and imbalance in our lives. Yeah, Holly.
What are the three trainers?
Oh, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So it connects right back up to the top, doesn't it? Yeah, any clarifying questions? We don't have much time. In fact, we're out of time.
I have a question.
Yeah, Gabe.
I have no idea what you just said.
Oh, yeah?
What the language you use is very opaque to me.
Oh. Yeah.
Can you be more straightforward?
Yes. I'm sorry, I'm letting my poetic sense get the better of me in clarity. So, are you just talking about the homework, or how far back do we have to go?
The homework.
The homework. Feel a place where you feel ethically unskillful in your life, where you've done something wrong or that feels bad, however it comes to your own heart and how it, what words come to you. So feel in for that place, and then share 2-3 sentences about it, up to a paragraph if you're feeling really inspired, and maybe offer a few words of the different levels of these 3 pure precepts. The level of it as just like thinking about ethical training, or degrees of kind of insightfulness, like in talking about, I guess, the refraining from evil, we could say is kind of a gross level of ethical living, and thinking into the many aspects of being that I can't fully understand within myself, and the subtle conflicts I'm creating with my own heart all the time. We could see those as different, levels of ethical insight, and say a few words about that, on how that feels interesting to you, or helpful or not helpful, and just make that as an offering to the class, to help us all kind of grow more awareness of ethics and where people are at. How was that?
I still don't really get it, but
maybe. Oh. Well, maybe with time that might have to be where we end it. Yeah. Well, if you're feeling really stuck, please email me and I'd be happy to talk about this more, but maybe I will not be any clearer over time. So, I apologize. All right, well, thank you, everyone. And we'll close with the refuges.